Khalil is across matters on both fronts. He's in Canberra and joined us here in the studio a few moments ago, looking at domestic safety and war in the Middle East, which teeters on the brink of possible wider escalation beyond Israel and Gaza. Peter Khalil, welcome back to the program. There's a fair bit happening around safety and security. We'll cover what we can locally and globally with you. Why don't we start out with the Bondi Junction attacks? The Director General of ASIO obviously briefed the Prime Minister at the weekend. That was stated by Anthony Albanese. Does this raise any concerns for you as committee chair about security protections on public places? We've been through this before, of course, when Islamic State was doing its best to harm. Does anything about the weekend highlight ongoing concerns for you?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Greg. Good afternoon. I think first and foremost, it's a tragic event that Australians are feeling across the country, and really our thoughts are with the loved ones of the people who have been killed and those who have been injured, and a small baby girl as well. So Australians are feeling this, and I think really viscerally. Look, the fact is that there were police on the ground, security agencies in the New South Wales Police, and a very brave Amy Scott, the inspector who was there and prevented further death. And there were brave bystanders like Faraz Tahir, a Pakistani migrant security guard who was killed also trying to prevent the attack or the attacker going further. On the point about the security, it's very difficult there will be a review and an investigation of this, clearly. But it is very difficult for security agencies who do a very effective job in keeping Australians safe from predicting, preventing, even managing random type attacks that emanate from, for example, this where there's a mental health issue, and it's very, very difficult to monitor that.
No, I accept that. Is it a good idea to review, as Chris Minns has suggested he will, the amount of protective equipment that is regulatorily unavailable at present to private security guards in settings like shopping malls?
I think you've got two parts of this. Obviously, looking at the resources necessary for security services, security agencies, but also investment and resources into the mental health space within the health system. And I think that's really important, because early intervention can prevent some of these events, hopefully, from occurring. And that requires a whole of society kind of input. And I know we've put that front and centre in our investments in mental health into the system, but then more needs to be done. Obviously, the work that's being done with the federal and state governments, I know the health minister's working with state ministers as well on mental health and the system itself.
No, not all violent attacks are the same, and this one has a different character to some of the others that you've had to deal with in different roles around the federal parliament. Peter, let's move to recognition of a Palestinian state. When do you say it will be the appropriate time for Australia to actively consider it or do it?
Well, interestingly, firstly, I engage a lot with my local community, so the Palestinian Australian community, the Muslim Australian community, and there's a lot of pain and anguish that's emanated from the war. One Palestinian teacher in my area in the northern suburbs lost 50 family members. I mean, this is an incomprehensible loss. There's a lot of pain and anguish. And you know what, Greg, you know what he said to his students when they asked him, what can we do? He said, pray for peace. Everyone wants peace. Everyone wants the war to end. There are Jewish Australians here who have members of family members who have been killed on the 7th of October, or members of the families from the hostages that have been taken. So everyone's feeling the pain and anguish. And I think there's a need that across Australia people want to see an end to the conflict. So my view on this is that, as the Foreign Minister has said, a two-state solution is the only pathway towards ending this ceaseless, endless violence that's gone on for decades.
So when does consideration of a state, a Palestinian state, come into that?
I think, given everyone of goodwill wants to see a two-state solution and an end to the immediate war. So all Israeli hostages have to be released, end to the hostilities, access to aid to help rebuild broken lives in Gaza. But as you transition to those negotiations, the parties are going to have to come to an agreement on a couple of those issues that have been long-standing. I think Australia can play a constructive and substantive role. With respect to our recognition of a Palestinian state, we need to be part of the process with the international community to help those parties agree to those areas. So a timing of that is dependent upon making sure the international community does what is necessary to help the political, security and the economic transition on the ground in Gaza. We need to make that effort, not just for the Palestinian people, because that is about self-determination and justice statehood. It's also in the long-term interest of the Israelis and people across the region. And it's also in the long-term interest, I think, of Australians here, because I've been very concerned about the disruption to social cohesion, parties and individuals who seek to politicise and weaponise this tragedy for political gain.
Is that getting worse in your local observations around the electorate of Wills, where you are in Melbourne, the tearing or the fracturing of social cohesion?
Well, I would say, and then this is a really important point, this is not about politics. This is about the multicultural society that we have built up into this country, which I've been involved with as a migrant, and many millions of Australians, the harmonious multicultural society that we have. It's kind of a minor miracle globally that we have this. And yet there are those actors, whether they be the Greens political party or the Socialists or Peter Dutton, who are seeking to escalate the tensions and to sow division and discord and to try and rupture that kind of multicultural fabric.
And that is unacceptable in my view. Succeeding?
Well, there is certainly a very concerning disruption to social cohesion. I've been concerned about it. I would say very clearly that I support 100% protest. It's part of our democracy. But when that starts to move over into hate speech, when it starts moving over into threats of violence, that is unacceptable. And I think most Australians would never accept that. The work we've been doing as a government, and I've been doing in engaging with my community, is about how we can find peace now and into the future, have Australia be involved in helping create that Palestinian state and peace for Israelis and Palestinians.
Can I just take you back to a precondition that you touched on a little earlier in our conversation, Peter Khalil, and that is that the two parties, the Palestinian people and Israelis, must agree. In your view, that is necessary. That precludes Australia embarking with, say, the UK, Canada or New Zealand on some sort of unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state. You're saying there would have to be agreement between Israel and Palestinians before Australia.
As the Foreign Minister has very clearly stated, Hamas can play no future role in the Palestinian state. There needs to be a reformed Palestinian Authority as well, and a new government that can negotiate and sit down and bring the parties to the table to come to agreement on the key issues that need to happen. And then we can play a very, I think, constructive and substantive role in that with our international community partners like the UK and Canada and New Zealand and many others, because it's actually in the interest of the international community to see peace in that region. And of course, we don't want to see a broadening of this into a regional conflict, which is another concerning element of the attacks that we've seen recently.
Well, exactly, and that was where we were going to wind up our conversation, Peter Khalil. Unescapable that over the weekend, Iran fired missiles and drones directly on Israeli territory. Do you think this is a precursor to wider regional escalation?
It is deeply concerning, and it's been condemned by the Prime Minister, by world leaders across the board, because we don't want to see an escalation to a regional conflict which will bring millions of people into more suffering, more pain and more misery. And Hamas, which is a proxy of Iran, and others who would continue that violence, we are working to try and de-escalate to ensure that we can move towards a peaceful transition in the region. This could go wrong, and it has in the past, obviously, in many different ways, Greg, but that doesn't mean you don't. That doesn't mean you give up, and it doesn't mean you stop trying. You have to keep working at it and use diplomacy and use every best effort to try and reach a peaceful conclusion.
All right. Well, I'm sure we'll discuss this further. You have a valuable vantage point in the Parliament as Chair of the Intelligence Committee, Peter Khalil, so we'll stay in touch. Always appreciate it when you can join us.
Thanks, Greg.